Joshua Zetumer, you're the creator of Say Nothing, and Michael Lennox, you're an executive producer and director on the series. And it's based on the book by Patrick Radden Keefe about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. How familiar were you, the two of you, with the book and the events it depicts before the opportunity for the series came about? Josh?
Yeah, well, I was sent the book very early. I think, right around the time it was being published. So I've been intimately familiar with the book now for many years. And before that, I had, my first job in Hollywood was writing a film about the IRA. When I was about 26, 27 years old. And so I was sort of steeped in the troubles long before reading the book, which I think was probably why producer Brad Simpson thought I would be a good fit to kind of create the series.
How about you, Michael?
Yeah, well, you can probably tell from my accent. I grew up in Belfast, so obviously, growing up as a sort of child of the 90s, of the tail end of the Troubles, we know a lot of stories, and I knew a bit about the stories, in the book. And the book was actually passed on to me by an American friend of mine. And at first, I was quite cynical towards an American. He had written this book about Northern Ireland, and I ended up binge reading it in a weekend, and it sort of just floored me emotionally and opened up a story in which I thought I knew, but it managed to get under the surface in a way where when I found out they were making this into a series, I was sort of compelled to be part of it.
As we see in the series, the Troubles were a time shrouded in a lot of secrecy. How do you approach a story about real events with so many unanswered questions or unofficially answered questions? Josh?
Well, I think for me, as an outsider writing the story, I think it had to be treated with a ton of respect, and it meant I had to do just a crazy amount of research, a profound amount of research, if I was ever going to hope to get the details right. And with a series like this, the details are really everything. And that really meant, as an American, I grew up in California. I had to teach myself to write Belfast dialogue without speaking in a Belfast accent myself. And it meant that, I wanted to bring on collaborators, people like Mike, who had a different perspective, a closer perspective to the events. And it meant that if Mike had questions, if he had thoughts, that I really wanted to listen. A lot of it was really just interviewing people, really trying to go beyond the four corners of the book, doing my own intensive research process, and then also really listening to people like Mike who had a closer perspective.
How about you, Michael?
Um, I think, I think for me, it's growing up in Belfast and knowing Belfast is a very small place. Northern Ireland is 2 million people, so I know a lot of people who lived through the era. My parents lived through the era. So for me, it was just treating it with utter respect and utter sensitivity. And again, like Josh said, researching as much as I possibly could. And because I grew up there, I had sort of a quite a big access of people who lived through the time period. And it was just trying to make it incredibly truthful and as authentic, what I mean, as I possibly could, and sort of my personal lived experience of growing up in the place and trying to bring that into the creative process, but also the production process.
And what were the discussions like about like setting the tone in those first episodes, from a storytelling and a directing standpoint, Michael?
Well, I think for me, there's been a lot of wonderful films about, the Troubles and a lot of perspectives. And this and the perspective of the book, especially looking at it of the Price sisters, it was important that we didn't sort of repeat what was done in the past, but there was something extremely fresh about the approach of what we were trying to do with the sisters and what Josh had written in episode one, and particularly towards the period of, 1969 and getting inside the mindset of what it's like to be 18 years old and idealistic and that sense where things are a bit more black and white and things are a bit more simple. So it was really trying to get into that mindset. And what was wonderful for me, because do the first two episodes and the last two episodes is I was able to do the sort of flip side of what happens, when you live through a conflict, like this, and Belfast changes and time changes, but you're left with the sort of decisions of youth, which has wrecked your life and wrecked a lot of other people's lives. So it was mainly to sort of set that tone up to the start so we could sort of journey through that.
And the tone, I think, was the most important thing to get right in the show. I think because the subject matter itself, can be very serious and very grim, honestly, if treated in if treated in a straightforward manner. I think the thing that was so important was that there was a sense of humor, that the series really felt alive, that you were balancing, humor and heartbreak, I think, which is part of the Irish storytelling tradition, frankly, where comedy and tragedy are sharing a bed together. And, I knew from the very beginning, if the show didn't have humor, we were dead, frankly. And the thing about it that was nice, right, is that the humor really came from the characters. It came from the real people. Dullars and Marion were described by people who knew them as charismatic, witty girls who were, very, very captivating, frankly, to a lot of people who met them, both because they were putting themselves on the line in service of some deeply felt belief, but also because, to quote one person who knew them, there was a smile to them. And I knew that the sense of humor really had to kind of come from them, as well as just represent kind of the attitude in Belfast, which is trying to find a way to laugh even in the darkest of times. And so I think the in the first couple episodes in particular, I wanted to capture the energy of what it felt like to be in your 20s and get caught up in a cause. And Dollars herself has a quote that says, I'm ashamed to admit it, but there was fun in those days. And I really tried to take that to heart in the writing. And it also meant, when choosing a director, to, obviously Mike, having all this experience in comedy, he directed every single episode of Dairy Girls. So you knew that finding the tone was something that Mike would be able to do. And that was honestly one of the biggest gifts that Mike gave us, is that there was the tone on the page, which was very funny. The scripts are funny, but that doesn't mean that everyone's going to see it, right? And other directors might have played it a little bit straighter. Mike just was carrying the tone in his heart from the very beginning. And that was, that's why he directed the show, and why we're so proud of what we've managed to put on screen. I think that you've got to find the right people in order to protect and preserve a specific tone.
Did you deviate much from the book in terms of structure or storytelling, or were there things that you wanted to include that you couldn't? You cover so much over 9 episodes, but obviously, you can't cover all of history.
Of course, I like to think that the book and the show are kind of like siblings. They're very different people, but they share a lot of the same DNA. And for me, I feel it's a faithful adaptation that gets right the spirit of the book. But, there's a lot of moments in the show where you don't have enough information. The IRA is shrouded in secrecy, right? So you can't know what was said in every room. And so, fortunately, me and the other writers on the series just did a profound amount of research. And at some point, you feel the characters well enough to be able to write without fear of, screwing everything up, frankly. And so, we were able to extrapolate and infer a lot about the characters and use those to kind of shape the scene. So, like, for instance, if you look at episode 3, Dullars has a relationship with a British soldier. I was really interested in this idea of befriending your sworn enemy, right? And what that would look like. And in reality, we honestly don't know very much about Dullars' relationship with the British soldier. I knew there was a real guy named Ian who Dullars had sort of become friendly with. And me and the other writers used that little scrap of information that I felt was really thematically resonant, and then used that to shape an episode long arc. So that was sort of the process. And then there are other sort of incredible moments in the book that we just couldn't use, frankly, whether it was because we didn't have enough money or because it didn't have enough emotional impact on the story. So if you've read the book, Brendan goes to prison and has this like epic prison escape that is one of the most vivid moments in the book. And I wrote a version of the prison escape, but ultimately had to leave it on the cutting room floor because it didn't do what we needed it to do emotionally for the story, and frankly, we also couldn't afford it.
Now the series explores the moral and political compromises of a resistance movement, and we're in an era right now where the morality of resistance has been, a subject of debate around the world. How do you hope the series will resonate for contemporary audiences? Start with Michael.
Um, Josh, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think we don't want to draw easy parallels to events that are happening in the world today. I think that would be a mistake. I think it's undoubtedly resonant, right? Because there's a lot of political violence in the world right now, and I think that I don't want to sit here and say that the IRA, represents such and such. I think the thing that the thing that feels resonant to me personally, and one of the reasons I wanted to create the show, was we live in a world where it's so easy to tweet, to post on Instagram, I support this cause or that cause. And I live in Los Angeles, right? It's there's a ton of people who will go online and spend 5 minutes and say they support this or that, right? And people in the IRA, specifically Dellers and Marion, they were out there living those beliefs, right? For good or ill, whether you think they're heroic or you think they're monsters, they're out there sort of putting themselves on the line for some deeply felt belief. And to me, that felt like the thing that was worth exploring, whether you agree with what they're doing or not.
And
Michael?
I think Daniel, just to add to that, not getting sort of trying to make parallels with other particular places, but there are certain, I think, universal things in this story and sort of, with any conflict. And I think what interests me is, the intense cost, of our choices in regards to, political violence, whether or not you're the person committing these acts, or else, the cost to the victims, themselves. And I think one thing about Northern Ireland currently, and I can speak about this presently, is we're all trying to understand how we view the past, how we should talk about the past. And there's a lot of places where we don't have that arena to talk about it. And what's that do when you're living with this stuff and there's nowhere to process it, and how we can learn from that. So I think them type of themes, I think something that hopefully as an audience anywhere in the world, we can sort of maybe, recognize that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, here you go ahead.
No, no, just to piggyback on what Mike said for 2 seconds, I think that one of the points of the show is that like silence is the antagonist, silence is the problem. Whether, doesn't matter what you think about the IRA, saying nothing, that's the problem. That's the fundamental issue. It leaves everyone with unprocessed trauma and pain, and things that they just can't get out of their body if they're not allowed to speak about what they've done or what's been done to them. And that to me was very much the point of the show.
The series spans different time periods. How do you go about casting like the younger and older versions of the main characters?
Well, the casting process was incredibly rigorous. We had 215 speaking parts for 9 episodes. And Mike and I were there trying to make sure that like IRA guy number 4 was authentic to the world of Belfast. We were working with casting director Nina Gold, who cast Game of Thrones and Star Wars and a million other things, who's really one of the best casting directors in the world. And I think Mike and I just drove her nuts, honestly, with I don't know. I'm like, is she going to return our calls? I hope she is. But you know, we were incredibly rigorous, and it started with the casting of the initial 4 young actors, and then everything kind of grew from there. And that was, you know, Lola Pettigrew, who plays Dolores Price, Hazel Dupe, who plays Marion, Anthony Boyle, who plays Brendan Hughes, and Josh Finan, who plays Jerry Adams. And I'll let Mike speak about Lola. I can talk about Hazel for 2 seconds, which I had seen Hazel in a small Irish horror film called You Were Not My Mother. And it was one of these performances that made you just like sit straight up in your chair. You see Hazel in this film. She's a teenager, and she's holding your attention in every frame by doing almost nothing. And it was this remarkable performance built around silence and stillness. And I knew that Hazel would be an incredible counterpoint to Lola, who was so boisterous and so out front and passionate. And it was really about creating that sister dynamic between them. And I'll let Mike speak about Lola because he's got a long-standing relationship with them.
Yeah, I think for me, Daniel, you know, when you're approaching, you know, a real story with real people in a real place, especially a place, you know, which I call home, it was just really important that the casting, you know, be authentic. And we have remarkable talent. I know I'm biased, but we do. We have remarkable talent in Northern Ireland. So especially when it came to Lola Pettigrew and Anthony Boyle, these guys grew up, you know, in West Belfast. They understand the world. You know what I mean? This is their world, their instincts, the DNA of their very being sort of bleeds onto the screen. I think as an audience, when you recognize, you know, that level of authenticity, which is, you know, specific in that sense, not to be a cliche, it becomes universal. So it was important for me that when it came to the, you know what I mean, to the acting and the accents and everything, it just felt real and had that feeling of realness. So I was a massive advocate for pushing that. We were very blessed to have people like Anthony and Lola and Josh and even, you know, Maxine from England, and the whole group just brought such a spirit of truth to the project, which I think comes across on screen.
And the only other thing I'd say about the young cast is it was so important for me and Mike and the other producers that the cast was young. And this was because the show was built around young people and this idea that this is what happens when you put life and death decisions in the hands of teenagers and people who are in their early 20s. And it meant that not only was it going to be more authentic, but also it's a lot scarier when the person holding the gun looks like a college student. And you know, there was a version of this show that was cast with people who were in their mid 30s playing, you know, kids in their 20s. And I think that would have been the normal thing to do. And it was really important for all of us that you know, these people feel like they were you know, the right ages. It would be more resonant and more emotional. And then when it came to the older cast, you know, we had this huge cast, and then we also had this very Herculean task of doing the time jump, where suddenly you would switch in episode 7 and the older cast would carry on the story. And, you know, we had to find incredible actors who wouldn't lose you when they took over the story, right? Because it would be very easy to make that jump and then the audience to just say, well, I'm no longer invested. This isn't my cast. And so I think with Maxine Peake, Tom Ben Lawler, Michael Colgan, who plays Jerry, and Helen Bien, who plays older Marion Price, I think they're so gifted. They're so gifted, and they were able to sort of seamlessly pick up the torch, right? Even for the ones that you hadn't seen before in the previous episodes. Um, and really make sure that the audience was still invested. When I watched the show, I watched the last few episodes. I it's really pretentious to talk about your own work, right? It's actually it's deeply lame to talk about things you've done. But when I watched the last two episodes, I have a strong emotional reaction to them when I see the Price sisters talking in prison, when I see Helen Bien and Maxine Peake talking in prison, having their final conversation. It's hard for me not to get choked up. And I think that the actors are bringing, they've just brought their own music to the language that was in the scripts.
Well, I want to congratulate you both on your work on the series. And thank you both so much for talking with me about it today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Daniel.